The words came in the middle of dinner, dropped into the conversation like something thrown through a closed window. My brother Marcus leaned back in his chair, let the whole table go quiet around him, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "Nadia, you have never been worthy of carrying this family's name. This bloodline has never had someone as worthless as you. You are the first disgrace." Nobody laughed. That was the worst part. The room didn't react with shock or discomfort, or even the awkward laughter people use when someone goes too far. My mother gave one small, nearly invisible nod, the kind that doesn't need words because it has years of agreement quietly stacked behind it. My father found something fascinating in the pattern of his dinner plate. And for one long, suspended moment, every person at that table, family members, old colleagues, former apprentices, and the attorney sitting at the far end with a gray envelope near his left hand, watched me the way people watch a glass fall from a countertop, waiting for the crack. But none of them saw what was coming next. I want to tell you something before we go any further. I have replayed that night more times than I can count, and the thing that still tightens in my chest when I think about it is not what Marcus said. It is that my mother nodded. Because a stranger's you can survive with your sense of self mostly intact. Family approval of that cruelty is a different wound entirely. It reaches places that public humiliation simply can't. But before I tell you what happened when my grandfather Solomon stood up from that table, you need to understand who we were, what the Adeyemi name meant in our city, and why everything that happened that night had been quietly building for longer than I understood. My name is Nadia Osei. I'm 35 years old. I work as a structural infrastructure consultant for the city of Atlanta, which sounds impressive until you explain what it actually requires. I spend my days reviewing load calculations on aging overpasses, stress assessments on drainage systems that were installed before some of my colleagues were born, and emergency response plans for buildings that were never supposed to still be standing, let alone occupied. It is slow, technical, deeply unglamorous work. A good decision I make in a quiet office might prevent a collapse or a flood that 500 families will never know almost happened, because it didn't. I have always been at peace with invisible winds. What I was not at peace with was being invisible to the people who were supposed to love me. The Adeyemi name came from my grandfather's side. Solomon Adeyemi built something remarkable from almost nothing in East Atlanta. He started with a single-bay workshop near Edgewood Avenue, a space barely larger than a double garage where he repaired scaffolding rigs, retooled heavy construction equipment, and did the maintenance work that kept other people's projects standing. Over time, that workshop became Adeyemi Builds, a training center, not a program, not an initiative, not a mission statement on a nonprofit letterhead. An actual place where young people who had been told no by every other system in the city could learn a real trade, earn a real paycheck, and build something they could keep. Kids who had aged out of foster care. Young men with records that made every job application feel like a wall. Single mothers who needed skill and stability, not a certificate they couldn't convert. Granddad gave them structural drawing, literacy, equipment certification, safety credentials. He put them on real job sites. He gave them references. He gave back whatever piece of self-belief the world had quietly taken. In Atlanta, the Adeyemi name didn't mean wealth. It meant the phone call that got answered. Inside our family, though, that name had twisted into something else over the years. My mother, Vivienne, loved the respect that came attached to it. She had grown up watching Solomon earn that respect one difficult year at a time, and somewhere along the way she decided that respect was an inheritance, something you could receive without doing the earning. My father, Raymond, had married into the Adeyemi orbit, and survived by aligning himself with whoever spoke the most confidently in any given room. And my brother Marcus had learned very early that if you showed up in a sharp suit with a firm handshake and enough conviction in your voice, people would assume you were the future. Marcus was 38, 2 years older than me. My mother treated him like he had been born with a designation that simply hadn't been made official yet. He worked in high-end commercial development, closing deals, repositioning distressed properties, attaching his name to projects in neighborhoods that were changing fast and quietly pricing out the families who had built those streets over decades. Every deal he closed became a dinner announcement. Every photo of him outside a glass office tower went into the family group chat within the hour. Every time he spoke over someone, my mother called it presence. Every time I stayed measured and methodical and patient, She called it timid. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself meaningful work speaks for itself eventually. I told myself the 250 homes that stayed dry during September's worst storm because of a drainage redesign I had fought 18 months to get approved were the only audience I needed. I was almost right about that. Almost. There is a specific kind of ache that comes from doing your best work in a room where nobody in your family will ever think to ask about it, Granddad asked. He was the only one who called after I completed a project, who listened when I explained what the technical details meant in human terms, who asked follow-up questions that proved he had actually processed what I told him. When I finished a retaining wall assessment on the west side, he asked which downstream neighborhoods had been protected. When I redesigned a drainage management schedule for the airport perimeter, he asked how many households sat inside the updated flood risk zone. He listened like my words had weight. My mother would smile in that distant, gracious way and say, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then ask Marcus about his latest closing before I finished my sentence. About a month before Granddad's 84th birthday dinner, the family group chat started feeling less like coordination and more like a stage being assembled for one specific performance. My mother announced the dinner with unusual formality. She asked everyone to dress nicely, arrive on time, and her exact words keep the energy focused and positive. In my family, that phrase had always been code for "do not make Marcus uncomfortable." A few minutes after her message, Marcus posted a photo of himself, standing beside a man in a charcoal suit in front of a building I didn't recognize. His caption: "Something big is coming for the Adiemi name." My stomach turned. Marcus had never set foot in the training center voluntarily. He didn't know the apprentices by name. He had once referred to the workshop as that warehouse with the smell. But he cared very much about land near Edgewood Avenue, which had spent the last decade quietly transforming into exactly the kind of neighborhood developers dream about: warehouses becoming rooftop bars, corner stores becoming boutique grocers, families who had built those streets disappearing, one rent increase at a time. I knew what Marcus was circling. 2 days before the dinner, my father called during my lunch break. His voice had that careful, slightly muffled quality it gets when he wants me to accept something unfair without making it loud. He said Marcus had been developing a vision for the family legacy. He said my mother was proud. He said he just wanted me to promise not to disrupt the evening. He used the word disrupt as if protecting the integrity of a community institution were a form of rudeness. I asked whether Granddad had been formally consulted. My father paused too long. Then he said, "Just be supportive, Nadia. This could be good for all of us." I remember staring out my office window at the downtown skyline for a long time after I hung up. That night, Marcus sent the family a 40-page presentation titled "A Vision for the Next Adiemi Generation." The first slide showed a luxury mixed-use development: glass towers, rooftop terraces, a curated ground-floor retail experience. Where the Adiemi Builds workshop had stood, the training floor, gone. The equipment bays, gone. The courtyard where apprentices ran rigging practice had been replaced by a resident wellness amenity. Marcus called the plan forward-thinking. He called the workshop historically significant but economically limited. He called the apprenticeship fund a legacy brand opportunity. Not a responsibility. Not a promise made to actual human beings who had reorganized their lives around it. A brand. By the last page, my hands were shaking. There was a payout projection for family members. My name wasn't included, but I barely registered that because I was thinking about Kwame. Kwame had been one of Granddad's earliest apprentices. He'd been released from a stint at Fulton County Detention Center at 17, with no record of employment and a family that wasn't in a position to help. Granddad hired him, trained him, vouched for him on his first job site. Kwame now managed structural maintenance contracts for 2 Midtown hospital buildings. He had 2 kids. He coached youth basketball on Saturday mornings. If Marcus's plan went through, there would be no Kwame next time. Only a framed photo of the old workshop in a lobby that none of the new residents would stop to read. I called Kwame the next morning. He told me the rumors had already started. A developer had walked the block. Someone had asked about clearing training equipment before spring. Before we ended the call, Kwame got quiet in that particular way that means a man is choosing his words carefully. He said, "Nadia, that place is the only reason I'm not someone's worst news story. Please don't let them turn it into decoration." I stopped feeling like the daughter nobody listened to. I started thinking like the engineer Granddad had always believed I was. I spent the following week pulling public records, trust documents, grant agreements, zoning covenants, and flood zone assessments tied to the Adeyemi Builds property. I found what Marcus clearly hadn't looked for or had looked for and decided to ignore. Grant obligations that would trigger repayment if the designated use changed. Environmental covenants that would delay any sale by years. Community benefit agreements signed during a previous rezoning cycle that created binding commitments to workforce programming. By the end of the week, I had a 14-page technical and legal analysis of exactly what Marcus's plan would cost in repayment liability, legal exposure, broken community agreements, and long-term reputational damage. I didn't send it to the family chat. My mother would have called me jealous. Marcus would have turned my concerns into a performance about my insecurity. My father would have asked why I couldn't let people be excited about something for once. Instead, I sent the document directly to Granddad, with one line. I'm not trying to interfere, but I think you should see what this would actually cost before anyone commits to anything. He replied 6 hours later, a single sentence. Thank you, Nadia. I needed information, not noise. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. But Marcus was moving like a man who had already won. He ordered a new suit. He posted about stepping up for the family. He started calling cousins and using the phrase "when I take over." My mother told family friends that Granddad was finally ready to pass the torch. Nobody said Marcus's name directly, they didn't have to. The whole family had been rehearsing for this particular ending for years. I want to be honest with you here. When I walked toward that dinner, I was not afraid of being humiliated. I had absorbed enough of that over the years to know it didn't kill you. What I was afraid of was what Marcus would destroy, if nobody with any real standing tried to stop him. Kwame's face had been in my mind for days, the faces of the people who would come after Kwame and never find what he found. The birthday dinner was held at a venue built inside the original Adeyemi workshop, building the same brick walls, the same iron beams, the same worn floor where Granddad had worked 16-hour days with a notebook full of unpaid invoices and a reputation for showing up anyway. The owners had kept pieces of the original space deliberately, exposed iron overhead, black and white photographs along the entryway. In one photograph, Granddad stood beside 4 apprentices wearing matching hard hats, all of them grinning like someone had just handed them a tomorrow. I arrived 10 minutes early, simple dress, 1 gift bag, and a folded document inside my coat that I promised myself I would not pull out unless I absolutely had to. The room told me immediately that this was not a normal birthday dinner. There were printed place cards. The tables had been arranged in a long formation that looked more like a boardroom than a family gathering. And at the far end, beside Granddad's empty seat, sat Mr. Fontaine, the family's attorney, a man who had handled Adeyemi documents for 3 decades. Attorneys do not attend birthday dinners for the cake. My mother spotted me first, wearing pearls and the particular smile she reserves for moments when people outside the immediate family are watching. Nadia, you made it, she said, as if my presence were a pleasant surprise rather than an obvious given. Before I could respond, Marcus walked in behind me, and the room rearranged itself around him the way it always had. My mother's whole expression shifted, brightened, focused. She straightened his collar and said, "There he is." Marcus gave a modest laugh. But he glanced at me to make sure I had seen. My father stood near the bar, holding a glass of water he wasn't drinking. He gave me a quick nod and looked away. That had always been his specialty. Almost kindness, almost courage, almost fatherhood. I moved toward the table and saw an open seat near Granddad. For a fraction of a second, I let myself believe it might be mine. Then my mother touched my shoulder gently and guided me to a chair halfway down the table between a cousin I barely recognized and one of my father's college friends. Marcus took the seat beside Granddad, like it had been held for him since before he arrived. Granddad hadn't come in yet. That mattered more than it might seem. Marcus was arranging the room before the person who actually owned it walked through the door. If I am honest, I sat exactly where my mother pointed. Not out of submission. Out of the knowledge that these moments are not won by grabbing chairs. They are won by being worth the seat that gets saved for you. Marcus worked the room while we waited. He moved between guests with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who believes he is the centerpiece of every story he enters. I heard him tell one of Granddad's oldest business partners that Adeyemi Builds was sitting on chronically underleveraged assets. I heard him tell a foundation donor that younger leadership could repackage the mission for the current landscape. I heard him, standing near the doorway beside a man in a steel gray suit who had developer written in the fabric of his jacket, say that the family has sentimental attachment, but they're ready to be practical. Ready to be practical. The phrase settled in me like a stone in water. Then Marcus came up beside me with sparkling water in his hand, watching his own room with the pleasure of a man admiring a painting he commissioned. He leaned close enough that only I would hear. Try not to bring up permits or project reports tonight. Granddad deserves someone with a bigger vision. Something cold moved through me. Not anger exactly, it was colder than anger, clearer. It was the moment you realize someone has always meant exactly what you suspected. I turned to answer him, and then I saw Granddad in the doorway. He had heard enough. I could tell by the quality of his stillness. Not angry, not reactive, but completely, deeply settled, the way a man becomes when he has already made his decision, and is simply waiting for the world to arrive at the same conclusion. Granddad moved through the room with unhurried ease, receiving the real respect that comes from people who remember what you did for them. He hugged my mother. He shook my father's hand. He received Marcus's loud, theatrical birthday greeting with a polite smile. Then his eyes found mine across the room, and for one moment, just one, I felt something in that look. Patience, warning, maybe something older than both. A sorrow that had already made peace with itself. Dinner began with careful, polished conversation. Then Marcus started performing. He didn't have conversations that evening. He held monologues. Every topic became a current that flowed back toward him. Someone mentioned the West Side riverfront development. Marcus talked about property values. Someone mentioned Granddad's old equipment repair contracts. Marcus talked about scaling operations. Someone mentioned the apprenticeship program, and Marcus smiled the smile of a man indulging a beloved but slightly quaint family tradition, and said, "Of course the mission matters, but every mission needs a modern vehicle." My mother looked at him like he was delivering revelation. About 20 minutes in, one of Granddad's longtime friends, a man named Mr. Adebowale, who had known Solomon since before I was born, turned to me across the table and asked about a stormwater redesign project I had managed in Vine City. The table nearby quieted enough for me to actually be heard. I explained that the neighborhood had experienced severe street flooding every summer for 4 consecutive years, and that the regraded drainage network had protected over 250 homes when the worst storm of last September hit. Marcus laughed before I finished my second sentence. "That's sweet," he said, leaning back. "But I think tonight is about something a little more substantial than drainage reports." The words landed hard. A few people produced uncomfortable smiles. Mr. Adebowale's expression cooled visibly. My mother shot me a look that said I had been the rude one. I set my fork down slowly. I said nothing. Marcus loved silence when he mistook it for defeat. He began describing his proposal without anyone officially inviting him to. He spoke about the Adeyemi Builds property as if he had personally discovered its potential, as if Solomon hadn't spent 30 years keeping creditors, floods, and developers off that land through sheer refusal to quit. He called the land chronically underleveraged. He called the training program a beautiful chapter of the Adeyemi story. That phrase made something tighten in my jaw. A chapter. A story. Something you close. Those apprentices were not a chapter. They were Kwame. They were a dozen people I had met over the years who had been told their whole lives they were disposable, and who had found in that workshop the first place that disagreed. I looked toward the entrance. Kwame was standing near the catering station with 2 former trainees who had helped cater the event as a personal favor to Granddad. His jaw was tight. He had heard everything. I finally spoke. "What happens to the apprentices when the training floor closes?" Marcus turned his head slowly, with the particular patience of a man who believes he is tolerating something beneath him. "They adapt," he said. "Successful people always find their way." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Nobody raised their voice. But something in the air changed the way it changes before a storm, when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. My mother rushed in, and only made it worse. "Nadia, this evening is about celebrating what Granddad built, not advocacy." I looked at her across the table and felt something old and long-held loosen inside me. For years, I had tried to reach her carefully. I had explained my work in terms she could appreciate. I had softened my edges. I had swallowed small humiliations and accepted half apologies and told myself that was what family required. But hearing her refer to other people's futures as my personal advocacy, as if concern for human beings were a personality trait, I needed to manage more appropriately. Something finally cleared. She had always understood me perfectly. She had simply chosen Marcus anyway. Marcus lifted his glass, reassured. Change is uncomfortable for people who've built their identity around maintaining things, he said. Some people preserve, other people lead. My mother nodded. My father studied his plate. Granddad's eyes stayed on Marcus steady, unreadable, giving nothing. Marcus kept going. He said the Adiemi name deserved someone visible, someone with relationships across the city, someone who could walk into any room and be recognized, someone not afraid of difficult decisions. Every sentence was polished and expensive sounding, and underneath every sentence lived the message I had been receiving my entire life in this family. You are small. You are peripheral. You are the version of this story that doesn't count. I could have taken out my analysis then. I could have corrected his numbers, exposed the consulting fee he had buried on page 31, walked through the grant conditions he had ignored, and let every person at that table see exactly how little Marcus understood about the trust he believed he was about to inherit. But Granddad had not moved. And I had learned enough from watching him to understand that patience is not passivity. Patience in the right moment is the most precise form of strength. So I waited. Dessert arrived. Candles were brought to Granddad's place, and the table sang with the forced cheerfulness of people who understood that something large was happening and weren't sure yet which direction it would fall. Marcus sang the loudest. Granddad made a small, private wish, and nothing in his face showed what it was. When the plates were cleared, Mr. Fontaine placed a gray envelope beside Granddad's coffee cup. Marcus noticed it the moment it landed. His posture changed a subtle physical recalibration, jacket smoothed, chin lifted a degree, eyes moving around the room to take inventory of who was watching. My mother's expression sharpened into something anticipatory. My father went slightly pale. Granddad folded his hands on the table and said, quietly and clearly, "Before I say anything else tonight, I'd like to hear Marcus explain what he believes the Adeyemi name means." That was the invitation Marcus had been constructing this entire evening to receive. He stood. He thanked Granddad. He thanked the family. He spoke about sacrifice and responsibility and the courage required to make decisions that sentiment can make difficult. His voice was warm, measured, and practiced. I could see people around the table responding to it, nodding slightly, leaning in, giving him the room. He was genuinely good at this. He had always been genuinely good at this. That was part of what made it so dangerous. Then his gaze moved from the rest of the room to me. And the warmth left his voice the way light leaves a room when someone pulls the blinds. "Of course," he said, "there are people who make a career of maintaining things, and confuse that with leadership. People who do careful, quiet work, and call it character. Who have never had the courage to step into a room and own it." He paused, and in that pause I could feel everyone at the table draw a breath. A name like ours deserves more than someone who manages drainage permits and calls it a contribution. He smiled. The smile was the one he had been holding all evening, sharp at the edges, satisfied, certain. He looked directly at me. And he said it. "Nadia, you were never meant to carry this family's name." No one breathed. Not the servers near the door. Not the relatives who had known me since childhood. Not my father. Not my mother, who only gave that small, unmistakable nod, quick enough that you could almost miss it, definitive enough that I never would. I noticed the chip on the rim of my water glass. I noticed the candle shadow trembling on the tablecloth. I noticed Marcus's right hand resting close to the gray envelope, as if he was already certain of what was inside it. Everyone was waiting for me to come apart. That had always been my assigned role in this family. Nadia absorbs. Nadia goes quiet. Nadia lets the room move on. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I didn't beg. I looked at Marcus, and for the first time I saw him clearly, not just my brother being cruel, but a man who had decided that turning humiliation into evidence was a path to the power he felt entitled to. That is a different thing entirely, and recognizing it made me almost feel sorry for him. Then Granddad's chair scraped against the floor. The sound wasn't loud. but it cut through the room like something final and irreversible. Granddad stood slowly, one hand on the table, the other near his coffee cup. Marcus's smile lifted for a fraction of a second. He thought the old man was rising to bless him. My mother straightened. My father closed his eyes. Granddad looked at Marcus and said, very quietly, "You believe she is not worthy of what this family represents?" Marcus gave a short, nervous laugh, still reaching for confidence. "I think someone finally needed to say what everyone has been thinking." Granddad nodded once. "Then she'll carry mine. And everything that comes with it." Marcus's face emptied. Whatever blood was in it left quickly. The fingers of his right hand found the back of his chair and tightened. He whispered, "No." Then louder, with something that was starting to sound like panic, "Granddad, you can't do this to me." Granddad's voice stayed completely quiet. "I didn't do this to you. You showed me the truth and called it leadership." Marcus shook his head. "I was trying to protect what you built. I was trying to make it viable. I was trying to—" "No," Granddad said. "You were trying to sell what you didn't earn." He turned to Mr. Fontaine, who opened the gray envelope and removed a set of documents. My mother's hand moved to her necklace. "Dad, this doesn't need to be public." Granddad looked at her steadily. He made his judgment of Nadia public. "The correction will be public too." Marcus tried to laugh. The sound came out wrong. Granddad read. For 5 months, Marcus had held meetings with a development group called Stratton Meridian, while implying he had authorization from the Adiemi Trust to negotiate on its behalf. He did not. The man in the steel gray suit near the end of the table shifted his weight. Marcus's jaw hardened. Granddad continued. The proposal included selling the original Adiemi Builds property, closing the training floor, reducing the apprenticeship program to a heritage display element in the new building's lobby. A murmur moved through the room like a wave. My mother said softly, "It was only a concept." Granddad looked at her without raising his voice. "A concept does not require a consulting fee." Marcus's eyes widened. There it was. The part he had been certain no one would say out loud. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Granddad lifted the next page. The proposal included a personal fee payable to Marcus upon sale completion. It also recommended eliminating direct student support from the apprenticeship fund and replacing it with a publicity-facing scholarship display in the lobby. Kwame looked away. His face was hard with something that ran deeper than hurt. Granddad saw him. Everyone did. And suddenly this was no longer only a family matter. This was witnesses. This was community. This was consequence standing in the room. Marcus pointed at me. "She did this. She went to you behind my back to poison everything." Granddad's expression didn't change. "Nadia sent me facts. You sent me slogans." He turned another page. Her analysis identified legal risk, grant repayment obligations, covenant violations, and long-term damage to the community commitments this family made and is still bound to honor. She asked for nothing in return. No title. No recognition. She asked me to look at the truth before anyone signed away a responsibility that belongs to more than this family. Marcus's voice cracked. "She's a city contractor. She doesn't understand how business actually works." Granddad looked at his grandson with something that was neither anger nor pity. "She builds systems that protect people. You build presentations to sell what you never earned." The silence after that had physical weight. Marcus looked around the table for someone to pull him back from this. My mother's expression had crumbled from pride into something fractured and confused. My father said nothing, but this time his silence was no longer covering for Marcus. It was exposing him. Granddad placed both hands flat on the table. "Tonight, I had intended to announce a transition plan for the Adeyemi Trust." Marcus straightened imperceptibly one last reach. "After reviewing what has been done in this family's name without authorization, and after hearing what was said at this table tonight, that plan has changed." Marcus stepped back as if the floor had shifted. Effective immediately, Marcus holds no authority to speak for Adeyemi Builds, the Adeyemi Trust, or the Apprenticeship Foundation. Any arrangement he implied or promised to Stratton Meridian is null and void. Mr. Fontaine has already prepared the appropriate notices. The developer in the steel gray suit quietly stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room without looking at Marcus. Without extending his hand. Without a word. That single, quiet, professional action hit Marcus harder than any insult could have. His deal left the room on its own legs, in front of everyone he had spent the evening trying to impress. Granddad looked at me then. His face softened just slightly, just enough. Nadia, I am asking you to serve as executive steward of the Adeyemi Builds Foundation and as the primary trustee representative for the workshop property. Whether you take the Adeyemi name legally or not, you have already carried what it means more faithfully than anyone else at this table tonight. I couldn't speak. I had spent 35 years wanting someone in this family to see me, not the quiet daughter, not the background professional, not the person who just maintained things, just me, and I did not know what to do with being seen when it finally happened. Marcus slammed his palm on the table. You're giving everything to her because she made me look bad? Granddad's reply was patient and immovable. No. I am trusting her because you made yourself clear. My mother found her voice. Marcus was overwhelmed. He didn't mean for it to come out that way. Granddad looked at her without anger. He meant it, and you agreed. Her face crumpled. Granddad looked at my father, and you looked away. My father's shoulders sank. No one had ever named his silence so precisely and so publicly, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise even him. Marcus grabbed his jacket. His voice when it came had gone thin and cold. You'll regret this. Granddad's reply was quiet. I would have regretted the alternative. Marcus walked out. The door closed behind him, and the sound felt like the last sentence of a story the family had been telling itself for years, a story that had finally run out of room. If you have ever been in a room where someone attempted to use your silence as proof that you didn't matter, if you have ever had a member of your own family declare your worth in front of witnesses and been met with agreement from the people who were supposed to stand beside you, then you know exactly what that silence felt like after Marcus left. Not relief. Not triumph. Something more like the first clean breath after a very long time underwater. My mother started to rise from her chair, reflex, the old familiar impulse to chase after Marcus when consequences got too close. Granddad said her name, once, quietly. She stopped. Let him go, Vivienne. Let him learn that not every door stays held open. My father looked at me for the first time all evening. The guilt in his eyes was almost harder to see than his silence had been, because guilt like that means the person always knew. He opened his mouth, closed it, and finally said, I knew Marcus had been in conversations with developers. I didn't know how far it had gone. Granddad looked at him calmly and said, You knew enough to ask Nadia not to cause discomfort. My father flinched. For years, he had treated peace as the absence of raised voices, even when that peace required me to absorb disrespect so Marcus could remain comfortable. That night, someone finally said the true name for it. Silence that protects cruelty is not neutrality. It is a choice, and choices have owners. The dinner didn't continue. The guests gathered in quiet clusters. Mr. Fontaine spoke in low tones with Granddad. The Stratton Meridian developer was gone. The photographer Marcus had hired packed his equipment without taking another photograph. Kwame found me near the entrance, eyes bright, and said, Thank you. 2 words. They meant more to me than every polished compliment the family had ever directed at Marcus. Granddad touched my arm and asked me to walk with him. We went through a side hallway that connected the main dining area to the preserved original workshop corner, a small alcove with old tools on a worn bench, a faded blue sign on the brick wall reading Adeyemi Builds in letters that had softened at the edges with time. He stood in front of that sign for a long moment without speaking. In the quieter light, he looked less like the man who had just dismantled his grandson's carefully constructed future, and more like the grandfather who had once placed my 7-year-old hands around a wrench on a Saturday morning and told me to feel the weight of what you're holding before you decide what to do with it. I didn't choose you to punish Marcus, he said. I chose you because when you saw something wrong, your first question was who would get hurt, not what you would gain. I stopped trying to hold myself together after that. I had been carrying myself so carefully for so long that I didn't immediately know how to stop. I told him I didn't want the foundation to become a weapon in whatever came next. He smiled a tired, real, sad smile and said, That is precisely why I can trust you with it. I accepted. I made 3 conditions before I said yes. The apprenticeship program had to remain fully operational. A fixed percentage of ADME Build's revenue had to go toward covering tools, certifications, and transit costs for trainees who couldn't afford them. And no family member would have influence over the foundation's direction unless they could demonstrate genuine understanding of its purpose, not admiration for its brand. Genuine understanding, Grandad agreed before I reached the third condition. The paperwork took a few months. The Stratton Meridian deal collapsed without the Adeyemi name and legal authorization behind it. Marcus didn't lose everything. He still had his career, his contacts, his considerable gifts. But he lost the thing he had organized his sense of self around, the unquestioned assumption that the future belonged to him by right of being chosen. That particular loss is its own kind of reckoning, because it doesn't come from anyone attacking you. It comes from reality, simply declining to agree with the story you've been telling yourself. My mother tried to apologize in the weeks that followed, careful messages, voicemails that began with "I never intended to," and trailed off before reaching the part that actually required accountability. I didn't rush to give her what she was reaching for. Forgiveness is real. It is not a vending machine. My father wrote me a letter. It was late and imperfect and awkward in the way that first honest things usually are, and it was the first time he admitted that his looking away hadn't been neutrality, it had been a decision. I kept that letter. Not because it repaired the past, because it was the first true thing he had ever handed me. As for the Adeyemi name, I didn't change mine right away. I thought about it carefully, and what I kept coming back to was something Granddad had told me years earlier, when I was still young enough to believe that recognition was something other people gave you. He said, "Nadia, a name is not a trophy. It's a promise. And promises are only as good as the person keeping them." I used the Adeyemi name for the new scholarship initiative instead. The first cohort of 50 students received toolkits, transit passes, and paid site placements with local structural maintenance crews. At the inaugural ceremony, Granddad sat in the front row. Kwame gave the welcome address. My mother came quietly and sat near the back, by herself. She stayed for the whole thing. Marcus didn't come. Maybe one day he'll understand that what he lost that night wasn't really power. It was the story he had been telling himself about who he was. That is a harder loss than any deal, any title, any room he could have walked into and commanded. Here is what I carry with me now. Here is the thing I want to leave with you. The people who tried to decide your worth for you were not operating from accuracy. They were operating from fear, fear that if you are seen clearly, something they believe about themselves might not survive the same scrutiny. Your value is not determined by the loudest voice at your family table. It is not determined by the parent who nods at the wrong moment, or by the sibling who discovered his confidence by borrowing yours. Your worth is built the way Granddad built everything, quietly, deliberately, in service of something real, over more time than ever feels fair. If you are doing that work right now, in a room where nobody appears to be paying attention, I want you to know. Someone always is. Sometimes it just takes a birthday dinner to make it undeniable. So before you go, let me ask you something real. If your family sat down and took a vote on your worth, would you have stayed quiet the way I almost did? Would you have walked out before giving anyone the satisfaction? Or would you have done what I did, held the facts close, trusted the truth to do the work, and waited? Leave a 1-inch the comments if you would have stayed quiet. Leave a 2 if you would have walked out. Leave a 3 if you would have waited, the way I did. And wherever you're watching from, right now, Atlanta, Lagos, London, Toronto, Manila, Auckland, tell me where you are and what time it is there. I want to know how far this story travels, because I believe the people who need it most are the ones watching quietly, in a room with the sound low, wondering if anyone else has ever felt this invisible inside their own family. If this story gave you language for something you've been trying to name for a long time, please subscribe. We'll be here every week with stories that are worth your time, stories about people finding their footing in rooms that were designed to knock them down. Thank you for being here. It matters more than you know. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental,